this is a proposed memorial. At the opening of the Memorial to Peace and Justice in Alabama, two women came up to me and they said, you know, we're very inspired by this project, and and they gave me these two cards, and they said our sons were murdered by gun violence in Chicago, and their faces, the sons' faces were on the other side of their cards. And we started a small organization, and we really need a memorial to the victims of gun violence in America. And I was pretty overwhelmed by that idea. And I thought, you know, of all the incredible work that the Equal Justice Initiative has done, it's the question of narrative construction and change, social change, that they do so effectively. And the narrative around gun violence has been so ineffectively narrated that we've continued to reproduce the polarizing discussion. And what would it take to do something that would fundamentally change the narrative? I spoke with Hank Willis-Thomas, who's there with me, and his cousin had been killed by gun violence, very important loved one of his. And we were soon introduced to the amazing people at Everytown for Gun Safety, who are here with us, actually. Yeah. So, and I spoke with Noelle there on the phone and said, this is an idea that may seem crazy, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you said something to the nature of, we've thought about spatializing our victims of gun violence, and we haven't been able to do it yet. And this has been something we've talked about. And we'd be really interested in talking about it together. So I was super inspired by that. Again, the kind of commitment to not just, how do we change the narrative? You begin with the individual humanity of each of these victims and the family members themselves who are suffering their own form of trauma and isolation in our country without being able to share in that collective ritualized mourning that we were confronted with in Rwanda that's been so productive in reducing violence. So we have been on the phone talking about this, and this is really the first time I'm sharing it with the public. It's in a very nascent stage, but it's something...
And we're honored to be part of that. No, really, I think it takes a lot for an artist, architect to come up and show a work in progress. So we do appreciate that, Michael.
Yeah, well, I welcome your thoughts and encourage your input.
Great.
The memorial begins with a call to action for those who want to be engaged. We would reach out through these survivor networks to ask them if they're interested, much like in the London Holocaust Memorial, if you choose to engage. And if you do, we would then send you a glass box. And in that glass box, you would contribute an artifact, much like a kind of tribute to what I talked about in South Africa. And we would, an artifact, something of a loved one that was killed. And that artifact would come back to us, and then we would cast that artifact in a glass brick. And we would then use those glass bricks, store them until we had enough from that place, maybe from the state for 2017. In Alabama, there were, in Indiana in 2017, there were 946 deaths by gun violence. And while we store them, they begin to create and collect these oral histories of these individuals. Now in a temporary resting place with others who share their time and location. And then eventually, when all collected, we would then construct into glass houses that would be inhabitable, and we'd be able to walk inside of and reflect upon these victims, these the victims and the families of the victims, all through this kind of refracted light that comes through a glass brick as well as the object within the brick. We've thought about the location of these also being here in DC, and we've suggested putting them on McMillan Park in the shape of an American flag.
You know, when I first saw that picture, I told you, Michael, that from a distance, you know, from my memory, it almost looked like Arlington, not quite as filled up yet, but it did have this effect of this collection that just is memorializing the fallen.
I think that's right. It brings, it creates space for a discussion around the complexity of gun violence. Not all of us know that most gun violence is suicide, actually, right? It creates an environment where we can both see the patterns and actually inhabit these homes that are both these kind of domestic dwellings of our dreams, but also our nightmares. And then, of course, McMillan Park is a fascinating place because it's the oldest sand filtration, water filtration center in America. It's designed by Olmsted, and it's massive, and underneath are these catacombs where water from the Potomac was brought in and then filtered, and then the residents of DC drank it. Now it's no longer in use, and it just sits fallow there waiting for, I think, a developer, but we are interested in talking with the city about even a temporary option to think about this as a moment to change not only how we in the city memorialize, but where we're memorializing, and different ways to memorialize. The collection of one brick is as powerful as the stacking of those bricks into a collective home. So these are conceptual ideas about something that is completely grassroots and comes not from a commission or a competition entry, but really just from meeting two mothers and having these amazing conversations with such incredible activists, artists and designers and architects and activists, have to come together to think about our collective social justice work, our social activist work, through a multiplicity of interpretive lenses, right? And spatializing memory is one of those things I've been completely persuaded is a necessary part of that journey.